It began inside the marble walls of a towering tech headquarters where innovation was worshipped, and status spoke louder than silence. A man in a faded uniform walked unnoticed, mocked by those who never asked who he used to be. But as secrets surfaced and quiet truths came to light, everything changed. Stick around and don't forget to hit subscribe before we dive in. The glass walls of the Cinera headquarters shimmered under the noon sun, reflecting the sharp suits and sharper glances of executives streaming into the auditorium. It was the annual Innovation Summit, a high-profile event showcasing the company's newest technological breakthroughs. Only senior managers and board members were permitted in the prototype exhibition hall that afternoon. Security badges blinked green at every checkpoint. No one noticed the old man in the faded blue uniform pushing a mop bucket down the corridor. Elliot Shaw, 67, had been the night janitor at Cinera for nearly a decade. His gait was slow but steady, his hands rough from years of labor, and his uniform creased in ways that time no longer bothered to iron out. He wore no name tag. Most assumed he was with facilities, a relic from an era long past. That morning, Elliot had been asked to check a flickering light near the east wing, and with the main elevators blocked for the summit, he had wandered through the presentation hall, mop in one hand, small leather notebook in the other. As he stepped into the vaulted room of glass displays and humming electronics, the air shifted, conversations paused, heads turned. "Hey, who let the museum exhibit?" in one of the younger employees snorted, nudging his friend. Laughter bubbled up in the back row where a cluster of marketing interns had gathered. Phones were drawn, lenses raised. Elliot didn't flinch. He simply scribbled something in his notebook, his eyes lingering on a flickering sensor embedded into the base of a holographic stand. "Seriously, what's he doing here? Looking for a time machine?" Another chimed in, already posting a video clip captioned, "Relic roams the future?" A third, emboldened by the group, stepped forward. "You know this area's off limits." "Right," he said, smirking. "This isn't the hallway to the janitor's closet. It's for people who went to college." Elliot looked up at the young man, eyes clear, tired, but without an ounce of shame. "Just checking the lights," he said softly. The group chuckled again, but Elliot was already turning away. He walked with calm precision, jotting another note. His gaze moved across the exhibit's 3D printed circuit boards, AI-assisted optics, thermal regulators until it landed on a device in the far corner. It was sleek now, upgraded and enclosed in tempered glass, but its core design, Elliot knew it intimately. It had been a prototype once, born from long nights and black coffee, drawn on napkins during a time when Cinera was still operating out of rented warehouse space. He and his daughter had built the first working model in their garage 30 years ago. Elliot stared for a long moment. Then, as the echoes of laughter faded, he turned back to the broken light panel overhead and raised his flashlight. The notebook remained open beside his mop bucket, the words neatly written in pencil: "Replace ballast, reseal conduit, Unit 4B still ours." Elliot replaced the flashlight in his pocket, leaving behind the polished innovation gallery and the quiet chuckles that trailed after him. He never looked back. The corridor outside buzzed faintly with the sounds of distant presentations and coffee carts wheeling past in a rhythm he had come to know over the years. But none of that noise reached Elliot. His steps were measured, deliberate, as he returned to the utility elevator, past the framed photos of Cinera's founding innovators' faces he once called colleagues. The basement hallway, dimmer and less pristine, greeted him like an old friend. Elliot took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. He placed the notebook back into his jacket. The binding had frayed at the corners, and the company's first-generation logo, one long retired, was barely visible beneath his thumb. That notebook had been through more redesign meetings, budget cuts, and emergency rewires than any current employee could imagine. Back then, he wasn't Elliot the janitor. He was Shaw, senior mechanical engineer, with a corner cubicle cluttered with circuit boards and his daughter's sketches. Ella Shaw, bright, sharp, and brilliant, was recruited straight out of grad school and placed on his team. Officially, she was just another junior engineer, Unofficially, she was his daughter and the reason he stayed at Sonera years longer than he'd planned. That all ended 9 years ago. A machine failure in the testing bay, a faulty safety override, a sound Elliot still heard in his sleep. He'd buried his title the same day he buried her. After the memorial, after the HR department sent flowers and the legal team wrote the check, Elliot submitted a letter not of resignation, but of transfer. No fanfare, no explanation. He took a position in facilities as janitor, on the night shift. The leadership didn't question it. Perhaps they assumed grief had shattered him. Perhaps they thought he wanted charity. But Elliot didn't want sympathy or recognition. He wanted proximity to the place where Ella had worked, where her voice once echoed during late-night prototypes, and where her last design still sat archived on a forgotten hard drive. Most of the new hires had never heard of him. Some of the older engineers vaguely recalled a Shaw from the early days, but assumed he'd retired or moved away. None would imagine the man in the janitor uniform had once drafted the original specs for the company's thermal modulation core, the same technology now powering their upcoming generation of adaptive displays. On the 12th floor, Grace Vang leaned forward in her chair, frowning at a paused video on her tablet. She hadn't meant to watch the clip. One of the interns had uploaded it to the company Slack, joking about the janitor infiltrating R&D. Normally, she would have rolled her eyes and closed the tab. But something had caught her attention in the footage. Not the janitor himself, but the notebook he carried. Grace enlarged the frame, squinting at the barely visible emblem printed in faded ink. She knew that symbol. It was the company's prototype emblem, used only during the first 2 years of Sonera's existence, long before she joined. More striking was what lay beneath it, shorthand equations and circuitry diagrams jotted in tight, angular script. She recognized that handwriting. It matched the annotations preserved in Sonera's oldest archives, schematics notes, left by one of the original engineers. She pulled up the archive blueprint for the modular optics array and compared the notations. Identical. Grace sat back in her chair, her brow furrowed. How could a janitor be holding a field book containing notations that hadn't been used in over 2 decades? There were only 3 surviving copies of that document. She'd seen them herself during her onboarding tour 5 years ago. They were kept in the vaults for historical reference, unless there had been a 4th, one never logged, one carried out in someone's pocket. Her curiosity ignited. She opened the internal directory. Typing in Elliot Shaw, no photo appeared. Just a short facilities listing part-time, night shift. No direct reports, no technical history, no credentials. Just a start date 11 years ago. She clicked deeper. One line stood out: transfer approved from engineering. 2014. Clearance revoked. She stared. Engineering scrolling further. She found the last recorded project linked to his name: optical core modulation. Phase 3. Her jaw tightened. That project wasn't just technical legacy. It was the foundation of Sonera's market dominance. The core technology still supported 40% of their high-revenue product line. And this man, this janitor, had walked right past their latest model, inspecting it with the kind of familiarity no intern or even department head could feign. Grace stood from her desk and crossed the room to the storage cabinets. She pulled out a worn project binder from the legacy archive drawer, flipping to the team photos from early development. There, beside a younger version of the current CEO, stood a tall man with thick glasses and a confident smile, holding a soldering iron and a cup of burnt coffee. The name stitched into his lab coat: Elliot Shaw. She stared at the photo, then back at her screen. The man mocked by interns was not some wandering relic. He was the architect, the ghost in the circuits. For a moment, Grace hesitated. What would bringing this truth to light mean? Would it embarrass those who had mocked him? Would it shatter the neat narrative Sonera told about its success? She looked again at the photo: Elliot beside his daughter, Ella, their shared features unmistakable. No, this wasn't about ego or revenge. It was about respect. She closed the binder, took a breath, and sent a message to the head of HR. We need to update the internal records. There's someone in facilities you've forgotten, and it's time we remember him. Grace sat at her desk long after her message had been sent, fingers steepled beneath her chin. Outside the office windows, the sun dipped toward late afternoon, casting golden streaks across the high-rise skyline. She replayed the archive footage again this time, not for the notebook, but for Elliot himself. His gaze, though quiet, carried the weight of memory. It was the look of someone who had built something from the ground up, then watched others forget it. At the same moment, in a conference room on the 15th floor, CEO Caleb Dunn was handed a phone by his assistant. The number was one he hadn't seen in years, but the name that popped on the caller ID made his breath catch. General Royce Caleb answered, rising from his seat, waving off the waiting strategy team. Caleb, sorry to cut through a protocol, but I just saw Elliot Shaw. Caleb froze. Shaw. Here, yes. Mopping floors in your headquarters, wearing blue coveralls. There was a silence so deep the air felt thinner. Are you sure as I am, that he saved my life twice? And yours once? Caleb's fingers tightened around the edge of the conference table. No one ever found out what happened to him after the incident. After Ella, I guess he didn't want to be found. But if he's here, if he chose to be here, you need to decide whether to let the past rest or bring it home. Caleb's voice was quiet. I'll take it from here. He ended the call and turned toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, almost absently, he spoke to his assistant, cancel the next session, and prep the auditorium for something else. Clear the internal press. Downstairs. Elliot stood before a holographic panel, his face half lit by pulsing circuits inside the projection shell. The device had changed sleeker now, and encased in polished alloy, but the logic beneath it was still his, or rather, Ella's. She had redesigned the thermal regulator months before she passed, making it 10 times more efficient. The team had rushed to submit her specs posthumously. No one ever mentioned her name again. Behind him, the same group of interns hovered, giggling. One mimicked his posture, another whispered a joke about him trying to mentally hack the hardware with old man vibes. Elliot didn't react. His hands, rough and worn, rested lightly on the mop handle. He wasn't angry, just present. In the back of the exhibition room, Grace entered without a word. She watched the scene unfold, her lips tightening, her jaw set. Then her eyes moved to the hallway, where several senior staff had gathered, whispering. Word had begun to spread, and then everything changed. The side door opened with a soft click. All conversation ceased. Into the room stepped Caleb Dunn, not flanked by security or PR staff, but walking alone, sleeves rolled to the elbows, expression unreadable. He scanned the crowd, his eyes skipping past the interns, the VPs, the tech reporters. They stopped only when they found Elliot. Shaw, Caleb said. The old janitor turned slowly. Their eyes met. Sir, Elliot replied, soft and steady. Caleb stepped forward. The hush in the room was absolute. You built the core, Caleb said, not as a question, but a fact. Elliot didn't nod, didn't deny. I saw the schematic notes, Grace said, stepping beside them. Same handwriting, same numbering system. You were part of the founding team. Elliot finally spoke. Ella was the real innovator. A flicker crossed Caleb's face. She was brilliant. She still is, Elliot said quietly, gesturing toward the display unit. You've been running her thermal model for 6 product lines now. You just don't put her name on the patents anymore. There was no accusation in his tone, only a simple truth that dropped into the room like a stone in still water. One of the interns paled visibly. Another lowered his phone. Caleb turned to the assembled staff. This man is Elliot Shaw, co-author of Sonera's founding patent portfolio. One of the engineers who built the adaptive circuit framework your salaries depend on. Murmurs broke out. People shifted uncomfortably. But he's also the father of Ella Shaw, Caleb continued, whose work became our backbone, whose death we barely spoke of, and whose father, out of grief, chose to return here not to manage, not to reclaim, but to serve, quietly and without asking for anything. A silence followed, one not born of confusion, but of shame. Elliot's voice came low but firm. I didn't want recognition. I wanted to stay near what she built. Caleb stepped closer. We owe you more than an apology. You owe her a footnote, Elliot replied simply. And maybe some honesty in your next shareholder call? Caleb almost smiled. That can be arranged. Just then, the PA system buzzed to life. Attention! The Innovation Showcase has been paused. Please remain in your departments until further notice. No one moved. Mr. Shaw, Grace said, her voice measured, would you be willing to join us for a walkthrough of the prototype floor? There's a lot the engineers could learn. Elliot glanced toward the display again. Only if we start with the 1.4 regulator. That's where Ella's code lives. She nodded, eyes shimmering. Of course. As Elliot stepped forward, one of the interns, a red-haired young man who'd laughed loudest earlier, quietly removed his badge and extended it. I'm sorry, sir, he said. I didn't know. No one ever does, Elliot said, not unkindly. Caleb remained by the display, watching Elliot walk into the prototype chamber, flanked now not by mockery, but by reverence. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was respect. And in that moment, the janitor became visible again, not just to them, but to the legacy that never left the building. They followed Elliot through the glass doors, no longer with ridicule, but in silent reverence. From janitor to architect, the transformation hadn't come with a promotion, it came with recognition. And as Elliot stepped into the prototype chamber, surrounded by engineers, designers, and executives who now saw him for who he was, it felt less like a return and more like the quiet restoration of something that had been buried too long. Upstairs, preparations were underway for something entirely unplanned. CEO Caleb Dunn had called for an emergency board meeting, not behind closed doors, but in the company's central auditorium. No press, no script, just a moment that needed to be shared properly, with the right people watching. A matte black SUV rolled through Cinera's main gates just as the sun began its descent. It parked beside the marble steps, its engine cutting with a low rumble. The door opened, and Caleb stepped out in a tailored black suit, flanked by two founding board members. Their expressions were unreadable, but their presence said everything. This was no ordinary appearance. Word spread fast. Within minutes, every screen in the building displayed a message: staff assembly, requested main auditorium, 15 minutes. No one ignored it. Elliot, meanwhile, had returned to the janitor's locker room to wash his hands. He still wore the same blue uniform, creased and marked by years of work. His name patch was faded to near invisibility. He had no interest in changing it. When Grace appeared at the door, he simply nodded. I assume I'm needed. You're more than needed, she said softly. You're about to be remembered. When they entered the auditorium, over 300 Cinera employees were already seated. The chatter stopped the moment Elliot stepped into view, and then Caleb appeared on the stage. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he walked to the edge of the platform, scanning the room. Then, while locking eyes with Elliot, he lifted his hand not for a wave, but for a military salute. Crisp, clean, absolute. The entire room stilled. Elliot blinked once, then returned the gesture. His salute wasn't theatrical. It was practiced and precise. Old habits never left. Caleb turned to the crowd. There's someone in this room who helped to lay the first brick of everything you see today. Not metaphorically, literally. This man's work is embedded in the very circuits powering our next-gen optics. He co-authored the foundational patents of Cinera's adaptive logic technology, and he did so quietly, humbly, alongside someone even more brilliant, his daughter. Ella. A soft murmur rippled across the crowd. For decades, Caleb continued, Elliot Shaw served in silence. After losing his daughter, who died in the service of innovation and in this very building, he chose not to leave. He chose to serve in another way. As a custodian, as a quiet guardian of the house he helped build. He paused. Why didn't we know? Because we didn't ask. We saw what he wore, not who he was. And that ends today. A tall man from the legal team emerged from the side stage holding a long, flat black case. Caleb opened it to reveal two documents. One, the original 1991 Sonera design patent for the modular thermal optic core, now re-registered under dual names, Elliot Shaw and Ella Shaw. The second was a certificate of formal reinstatement, naming Elliot Shaw as Principal Emeritus Engineer, with full honors and lifetime rights. Mr. Shaw, Caleb said, this is yours, and long overdue. Elliot stepped forward slowly. He did not rush, nor did he smile, but his eyes glistened faintly under the spotlight. He accepted the documents, then placed them gently at his side before stepping to the microphone. I didn't come back for this, and he said, voice steady, clear. I came back because my daughter never got to finish what she started. I couldn't save her. But I could save what she loved. No one moved. She believed in design that helped people, not just the rich ones, that cooled homes without wasting power, that adjusted to human need, not market demand. She didn't get to see her name on the patents, but the code is still hers, and it always will be. He stepped back. For a moment, the room was still. Then, the board members, all of them, stood and applauded. Slowly, the crowd joined in, first in scattered waves, then rising, full applause. Not the kind reserved for corporate slogans or rebranding ceremonies, but for something real, something true. From the back of the room, a cluster of interns remained rooted. Their expressions changed entirely. One of them, Brandon, who had earlier mocked Elliot, had stopped recording halfway through. Now, phone lowered. He watched with the wide-eyed recognition of someone who'd been given a second chance to understand. After the applause quieted, a woman stepped forward from the front row. She was elderly, well-dressed, with a cane and a calm dignity about her. Mr. Shaw, she said softly, my son was one of the first technicians trained by your daughter. He passed away 3 years ago, but he always said she made him believe he was more than just a background player. He kept her handwritten notes pinned above his desk until the day he died. Elliot bowed his head. Thank you for telling me. Others came forward, engineers from past projects, retired employees who remembered Ella's laughter, quiet custodians who had always known Elliot's name, even when others forgot. At the very end, Caleb took the mic again. We talk often about innovation, he said, but we forget that innovation without memory is vanity. Today, we restore that memory. Today, we honor not only a legacy, but the silence it stood upon. He looked directly at Elliot. We salute the foundation. Elliot didn't respond with words. He simply stepped back from the light, returned to his documents, and quietly tucked them into his weathered satchel. Not for show, not for history books, just to carry home. The applause eventually faded, and Elliot stepped down from the stage carrying only the satchel that had always accompanied him. No medals, no fanfare, just quiet purpose. He declined the title, the press interviews, the speaking tour they offered. Let the work speak, he said, and with that, he returned not to a position of authority, but to the same halls he had walked every day for years, mop in hand, mind elsewhere. But something had changed, not in Elliot, but in everyone else. From that day on, no one called him the janitor. He remained in facilities, by choice, and showed up to every shift on time. Uniform pressed the way he'd always worn it, but the way people addressed him shifted from side glances and indifference to respectful nods, to sincere greetings. Senior engineers started stopping him in the halls to ask questions. He answered briefly, always deflecting credit. But what he offered in passing often became the foundation for deeper breakthroughs. It was Caleb who made the next move. A week after the assembly, he approached Elliot with a simple proposal. No plaques, no monuments, Caleb promised. But would you let us do something for Ella? Elliot paused, then nodded once. The result was the Ella Shaw Technical Scholarship, fully funded by the company's Innovation Endowment. It would go to students pursuing low-cost, socially driven engineering projects. No GPA requirements, no flashy resumes, just vision and grit. Elliot insisted on personally reading each application. I don't want the best, he said. I want the ones who've been overlooked. A few days later, a former intern, Brian, the one who'd filmed Elliot months earlier, requested a meeting. He arrived early, nervous, holding a printed still from the video as if it were evidence of a crime. I wanted to apologize in person, Brian said. I didn't see you. I only saw a story to make fun of. Elliot studied the young man for a moment before gesturing toward the maintenance closet. Come with me. Inside wasn't cleaning fluid or tools. Not entirely. Behind a false wall, Elliot had stored old prototypes, circuit boards half-wired, sketches folded neatly in plastic sleeves, notebooks with margins full of equations and annotations in two distinct hands, his and Ella's. This, Elliot said, isn't about forgiveness. It's about usefulness. If you want to learn, you'll help me restore these. And in return, maybe you'll see something worth building. Brian didn't hesitate. He showed up every Saturday after that. Quiet, focused, eager. He stopped trying to impress. He just listened and slowly began to understand that greatness wasn't in being noticed, but in being useful when no one's watching. Others followed. News of Elliot's quiet mentorship spread. Soon, a group of 6 employees, 3 interns, 2 junior engineers, and 1 IT technician began meeting weekly in what they jokingly called the Silent Lab. They didn't know that the name would later be adopted officially. Caleb, watching from a distance, eventually authorized the creation of a permanent space, a skunk works lab beneath the research floor, renovated but left intentionally raw. Concrete walls, steel tables, chalkboards, and shelves full of Elliot and Ella's old materials. They called it the E&E, Shaw Innovation Room. There were no supervisors, no formal hierarchy. Elliot led sessions the way he had always worked, with questions, not instructions. What do you see, he would ask. What doesn't belong? What does too much? He never lectured. He simply created space for people to think deeper. And the ideas that emerged from that silence, ideas about energy conservation, modular accessibility tech, affordable home diagnostics, began drawing attention. One of the engineers suggested publishing under Elliot's name. No, he said simply, publish under hers. The legacy began to breathe again, and so did Elliot. Though he kept his uniform, he began showing up earlier than scheduled, not for maintenance rounds, but to meet students who wanted to join the sessions. The scholarship recipients were diverse in every way: first-generation college students, refugees, retirees seeking second careers. Elliot welcomed them all, and each morning, as they passed him in the hallway, they greeted him not with titles, but with something purer respect. No one called him sir. No one tried to brand the sessions or film them for social media. That was the unspoken rule. This space wasn't about recognition. It was about rebuilding what had been lost. Still, the company recognized the shift. The board approved a line item for a new initiative, Quiet Mentors program, based on Elliot's structure. They funded stipends for senior employees to mentor across departments, to ensure that the Elliot effect wasn't isolated. But Elliot didn't care for what it became on paper. His focus remained with the real ones, the handful who showed up early, asked the right questions, stayed behind to sweep the floors without being asked. Each morning, as he returned to his post near the south wing entrance, young engineers now passed him and nodded respectfully, not out of obligation, but out of knowing that the man holding the access badge once held the company's future in his hands. One afternoon, Brian stood outside the Shaw room, clipboard in hand, waiting for Elliot to finish his rounds. "I read through the designs for the variable lens projector," he said. "Was that Ella's final model?" Elliot looked at the schematic. "No, that one was mine, but hers was better. It's still in the red notebook. I just couldn't finish it." Brian hesitated. "Maybe we could finish it together." Elliot didn't answer right away. Then he gave a slight nod. "We'll need better filament." And just like that, another quiet beginning took shape. The hallway outside the lab now bore a small, brass plaque. It didn't list titles or achievements. It read only, "In silence. Some foundations still grow." That fall, Elliot submitted his last project proposal, a low-cost modular battery unit designed for off-grid communities. It passed without fanfare. He didn't present it. He let the juniors lead. And when the design won an internal award, he stood at the back of the room, arms crossed, face unreadable, as the applause rolled forward, not for him, but for those continuing the work. That was enough. The battery unit was approved, and Elliot let the juniors take the stage. From the back of the room, arms folded as always, he watched them field questions with quiet confidence. In their responses, he heard not just technical knowledge, but something deeper: humility, clarity, a refusal to overstate. They had learned what mattered most, not spotlight, but substance. By the time spring rolled in, the air smelled of possibility. The small rooftop garden above the Shaw room had begun blooming again, thanks to a group of interns who spent weekends planting vegetables between prototype runs. Elliot never asked for it, but he noticed. He noticed everything. Then one morning, a black government vehicle pulled quietly into the circular drive of Cinera headquarters. An aide in a crisp Navy suit emerged, carrying a sealed envelope marked with the presidential seal. He waited in the lobby with practiced calm. When Elliot arrived, pushing his cart with replacement filters and a folded ladder, the aide stood. "Mr. Shaw." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "I'm from the Office of Science and Technology Policy. You've been invited to the White House. There's a national ceremony honoring contributions to civilian technology. The president would like you to attend." Elliot hesitated, mop still in one hand. Why me? Because of the Shaw room, the mentorship initiative, the scholarship, the off-grid battery program, and, the aide paused, "because we believe your daughter would have been invited if she were still with us." Elliot looked away for a moment, then nodded. "I'll think about it." He didn't reply for days. Not to the invitation. Not to the internal emails urging him to accept. Not to Caleb, who stopped by personally with coffee and a quiet word of encouragement. But eventually, late one afternoon, he left a simple note on Grace Vang's desk. "She always wanted to go, so I will." For her, the ceremony took place in May. Elliot wore no suit, no medals. He arrived in a clean pair of pressed overalls with a single stitch patch on the pocket. The Shaw Initiative. The embroidered logo was simple: a wrench crossed with a stem sprouting leaves. In the East Room of the White House, surrounded by CEOs and scholars. Elliot took the stage without a speech in hand. The MC had expected a prepared statement. What they got was something else entirely. "I fix things," Elliot said. "Sometimes I mop. Sometimes I tighten bolts. Sometimes I listen when someone younger thinks no one's paying attention." He looked out at the rows of faces. "I didn't come here to be honored. I came because my daughter dreamed of standing in this room. She died before she could, but the code she wrote still powers your smart windows. The model she sketched on our garage wall is still used in your hospitals. And the young people she inspired, they're still building." A pause. "Someone asked me what I really did at Cinera. I told them I just cleaned floors. But here's the truth. No one can clean someone else's dream if they don't carry part of it themselves." He stepped down. That was all. No applause request. No bow. But they stood anyway. Later that evening, after the receptions ended and cameras were put away, Elliot visited the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. He hadn't been in years. He stared at the black wall, polished smooth, watching his own reflection shift beside names he once knew. He didn't touch the stone. He just stood still, shoulders relaxed, hands in his pockets. There was no one left to salute him. But that wasn't what he came for. He came to say thank you for surviving, for having time with her, for finding a way to keep going. When he returned to Sinera, nothing dramatic followed. No headlines, no new titles. But on his locker, someone had taped a newspaper clipping from the ceremony with a handwritten note beneath it. He never left. We just finally saw him. Months passed. Brian graduated with honors. His senior thesis, Recovering Genius Social Impact Through Forgotten Minds, was awarded national distinction. He credited Elliot in his defense, simply stating, "He taught me that strength doesn't shout, it just shows up." He was offered a position at Cinera, which he accepted on the condition that he could continue running showroom sessions on Saturdays. Caleb approved without hesitation. Visitors now came regularly to the showroom, not for press tours, but to learn. A quiet culture formed around it, shaped by questions, not credentials. Engineers worked beside maintenance staff. Retirees mentored interns. Failed prototypes were displayed next to successes, annotated with lessons learned in different handwriting, Elliot's and others. And still, Elliot cleaned the south hallway every morning. One afternoon, a middle school robotics team from a nearby public school toured the facility. At the end of the visit, one of the students pointed at a framed portrait in the Hall of Legacy Elliot, standing beside Ella, both smiling in their workshop. "Who's that?" the girl asked. Brian, leading the tour, paused. "That's Mr. Shaw. He built this place before we even had walls. He looks like a janitor." Brian smiled. "He is confused." The girl tilted her head. "But also a scientist." "No," Brian said gently, "just someone who kept the dream from falling apart." The girl nodded slowly. "That's better than a scientist." And maybe it was. On the first anniversary of the Shaw Initiative's official launch, Cinera held a quiet gathering. No balloons, no corporate speeches, just shared food, some handwritten letters from scholarship recipients, and an empty chair set beside the main table. The seat bore a small wooden sign reserved for the quiet ones who built the way. That same evening, as the sun set over the Cinera rooftop garden, Elliot sat alone with a cup of tea, looking over rows of plants sprouting between solar panels. A soft breeze moved past, and in that moment, he felt her there not as a ghost, but as something more living than memory. He smiled, not the kind people saw on stage, but the one that reached all the way into his eyes. No one is just what you see, and sometimes the ones who are hardest to spot are the ones who made it possible for others to be seen at all.